I mean, I've got a couple of questions. One question is about the industry now. I mean, how has the industry evolved from the time that you started up to now? So that's one question. It's like a twofold. And the other question, I want to go a little bit deeper into albinism, right? And I would like to kind of like know more about your experience because obviously this is yes, subject that is dear to your heart, and I just want to kind of like delve kind of like deeper into it. So whichever way you want to answer the question, if you want to talk about the industry first, and the longevity, and how it
Mm.
has evolved, or the albinism question, whichever way you want to answer first.
So, in terms of the industry, when I started in South Africa, there were only two models that had somewhat um, some kind of noticeability. It was me and a woman called Rufino Budisela who had started modeling when she was 13. I had started modeling when I was 50, so I was considered an old model in several ways. I was like, it was like you're starting so late. But at the time, even the narrative regarding albinism, the things we were asked, they were always the same. Always the same. First of all, people would be interviewing you about style or fashion or whatever. That would be the content or the aspired content of the interview. And then when you read the article, it will always start with people in Tanzania being killed for muti killings, for albinism. 1 in 4,000 people have albinism. Albinism is a genetic disease. And I guess people were trying to educate, but I think that there was part of it that had an unconscious bias. Because if you're talking about something that's about fashion and lifestyle, this is not a medical article.
Yeah.
But you all feel like you have to explain the person who is before you. And one of the other things that was happening is that like, I was constantly called albino model. So I was not, the headlines would constantly unname me, and it would just leave me there positioned as a condition. And it was almost like a very charitable approach. Oh, we're giving this person with a condition a platform. And that is the reason why the stories that were constantly reverberating were stories about social exclusion, social death, all of that, as opposed to as opposed to even balancing it out and amplifying stories of connection and love, which were also true in my upbringing. As much as I had social exclusion, I also had love and belonging. I had that dichotomy. But there was only one that was particularly put forward, and you would see it exacerbated constantly, more so in the European and American markets, because it was almost like, I don't know how to say this. I think part of it, there was a sincere um, um, need to help, to say people with albinism are having this particular problem, the issues of multi killings, the issues of prejudice and stigma, etc., etc. I think there was that. But I think there was also, again, an unconscious bias to the racialization of Africa, to say, well, you guys do voodoo and
Yeah.
kill each other, all of that stuff. Um, and so I constantly felt like my identities were always in this crossfire. And now, I mean, I remember there was a time when I was sitting down and I was thinking, people were asking me to talk about women empowerment, and people were asking me to talk about where Africa is going as a nation, or gender-based violence. And I started thinking, when did this happen? When did I start actually talking about things that were not only focused on the social exclusion of albinism, but things that actually acknowledged all my other identities and the politics that are going through them? And I don't know when that happened, but that's the first thing that I noticed was changing. The variety of topics was changing. In other words, people were having a more human inspired approach because they could see you as a broader human being than what they saw in 2012. Even the roles that people were asking me to take, usually in 2012, they would just ask, it was just the Muti killing role. You were a victim of a Muti killing. You were running. That was just it. And it's not to say that these stories were not important. They were very important because at the time, you needed to penetrate the consciousness of the people to say that this is wrong.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was perpetuating the stereotype, and you could not imagine the body of albinism in another existence apart from social exclusion, being hunted, being. And when you have albinism, seeing those images, you experience a level of fatigue because you're watching it, and it's a constant affirmation of how little options you have, you know. And I realized that with time, though, first of all, you got critical mass. So you started having more people with albinism wanting to be models. And at the time, I was not sure if that was the right thing because I was like, almost like every second person with albinism wanted to become a model. And I was like, I don't know if this is the right way to go. I mean, there's engineering, there's science, but also I think that, there were pros and cons to it. But I do think that there were more people who wanted to go more in the modeling and culture space because they started seeing, even though we were somewhat, and I think me and Rafika were somewhat quiet about the prejudices we were experiencing, people did see the celebration of this body. And they saw that there could be social and economic and cultural mobility in this body, in this space, in this industry.
Yeah.
And I think if I was a lawyer and it was publicized that I had social economic, then probably you would have had more people wanting more to go into law, etc. So people are going through a constant analysis of their environment and their context because they want to know where they can find more ease and safe spaces.
Absolutely.
But in that way, it did work because you had more people, whether people were in banking or whatever, or law, they also wanted to do modeling. So the critical mass started changing the narrative from being linear and started diversifying in narrative. And I think it started diversifying in perspective. So now when you see acting roles, etc., of people with albinism, it is far more varied than it was 10 years ago. So definitely I do see that there's a difference.
And from what I'm hearing from you, I think you also had a lot to contribute to it because of your kind of like refusal to be put in the box, right? And the way you kind of like showed up in the different spaces. I mean, it's almost like with your character, it's almost like you forced, people in the industry to see you not as just this one-dimensional person, but as a multi-dimensional person. And as they kind of like dealt with you and interacted with you, and they also, it also helped change the perspective. So I think you are giving yourself not enough credit for for your contribution as well to this. I mean, that's what I'm hearing at least, and from what you're saying, that you actually did contribute a lot to kind of like changing those perspectives and changing those narratives, and you are still contributing to it. So yeah, that's one observation that I had. And about albinism. Can you kind of like tell me, how do you define it? How do you define albinism? Yeah, I mean, can you give me your definition? If you had a definition of that, I would like to hear it from you.
I think albinism is a biological phenomenon. A biological phenomenon where people are, where people's bodies are presented in a way that is much lighter than what is anticipated in their ethnic group. That is my definition of albinism.
Okay.
And I think that you even see it with white people who have albinism, is that they are lighter than what is anticipated in their ethnic group, including hair, and just light skin, hair, eyebrows, everything. They are lighter than what is anticipated even within their ethnic group when they have, white skin. And I think that is the real definition of albinism. I don't really think it's a scientific one.
Okay.
I think albinism, and I know this is very controversial, I know that probably most people disagree with me, I don't understand this term lack of pigmentation
Mm-hmm.
in relation and in reference to what and to who, you know? Because if you look at me, I've got ochre to albinism. That's what it's defined as. And I have some level of pigmentation because you see, oh, okay, this is not real hair, but my real hair is like it's like dark yellow, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that means that there's a level of pigmentation there. Now, what is my lack of pigmentation in relation to a lot of blonde white people? I like the difference. I have not found a difference that is explained scientifically.
Mm-hmm.
And albinism is generally explained as a phenotype.
Okay.
So you see, it's a diagnosis that you see. It's not like you can take my blood or anything to actually see what kind of makeup I have to say this person has albinism. So if you do not see me, you will not be able to say I've got albinism. You can take whatever samples you want to take, but you will not be able to say I've got albinism. It's a diagnosis that you see. And you know, apparently there are tests with regards to eyesight. So if it's seen that your baby struggles with eyesight, then you know, and I just find this test awkward because I think that again, it probably is more with regard to certain ethnic groups. Because with white people, for instance, I was at an albinism conference and I was hearing people say they didn't know they had albinism until they were 40. Obviously, as a Black woman, that experience is so far from me because you have albinism as soon as you're born in certain ethnic groups that have more pigment than others, you know. But, you know, in white societies, some people will say, well, I'm at 27, I realized I've got albinism. We don't realize we have albinism. Our societies don't realize that we have albinism with time. We are born into that social and political consequence from the get-go. Our parents are aware of it as soon as we're born, you know. That's why I think that it is a cultural, the medical description of albinism, I think, has a lot of culture in it.
Okay.
And yeah, I have my reasons for that.
Please.
But
please.
Would you like me to go?
Yes, please. I actually, when I asked you that question, I was expecting you to go a little bit deeper, you know. So there was a reason. I mean, go deeper than the biological one, you know. So, but that was like kind of like my little idea behind the question. Yeah.
The thing is that, and this goes a little bit into history, I think we never really understand our present if we don't go into history. And I think that otherwise we think that things are objective and they're just the way they are, but they're not. They are a product of ideas. And if you look at, you know, I think around was the 16th century or so, I'm not sure, but you had a Portuguese traveler who saw Black people who were white skinned, and he called them albinos. He documented them as albinos. But albinos means white person. But when he was talking about white person, he wasn't particularly racializing. I'm projecting here this one. He wasn't particularly racializing because racial ideologies were not, the foundation of them was not that strong as yet. So he was more descriptive. Yes, he considered himself like a light person, but he considered them white people in comparison to their group. So it wasn't a racial statement. It was a descriptive statement of what he was seeing. And with time, you see how people like Buffon, Thomas Jefferson, etc., how they were now grappling with this Black, white-skinned person. In French, I think they call it Negro Blanc or something like that. I can't remember. And you know, basically, we were literally called white Negroes. Now, if skin color is supposed to carry privilege and superiority, and now it is on the skins of people who were supposed to be hierarchically the lowest in society, this doesn't make sense. It completely disrupts the binary that is so precious to you and that is also building your economies through slavery. Now, what do you do with that? And I think they grappled and grappled and grappled with it. And to a point where they actually, there was a time when, I think it was a lot of French naturalists who saw albinism as like monstrous and not human, to a point that they were even willing to say Black people who were not like this were human, and these people are not human. Because you can see there's this grappling with why is your skin white?
Yeah.
Why is your skin white?
Yeah.
And after some time, you had people like Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was German, and long story, but he termed white people Caucasian. He was the person who actually termed white people Caucasian. The term Caucasian was more vast before that, but long story. He pathologized albinism. He called it leukopathia or something. I can't remember the exact name or the pronunciation. But the name translates to a diseased whiteness.
Okay, all right.
And that idea became more popular because now it stabilized the status quo. Then all of these people are white because they're sick. Now we're fine, Now you've got white people and Black people, and if Black people are white, they're sick, So yeah, but I don't know that I would know. Actually, now lost my train of thought. Listening to all of that. But yeah, so I think that for me, at least albinism in the Western sense, I do think has a very strong racialized aspect. And I know that this is not a popular deconstruction of albinism.
Yeah.
But from everything that I have read, because I went, as much as I was telling you that I went into feminism, critical race theory, I went into albinism because I wanted to understand so much in terms of race, in terms of albinism, in terms of feminism, in terms of just all of this. How did we get here? Because if you understand how we got here, it empowers you more to have the tools to know where the problem lies.
Absolutely.
And with albinism, I think one of the problems is that it became seen as a disease and a deficiency, mostly to stabilize racial ideologies. Yeah, and that's the reason why, if you see something like albinism, now is albinism a disability? I actually think it is a disability, because a great deal of the time you find that people with albinism have skin sensitivity to the sun, they have short-sightedness, but this is not true for everyone with albinism. That's why it is not scientific. Okay. That's why they cannot say albinism is a lack of pigmentation which results in visual impairment. You cannot say that as a fact, because not your entire populace will have that as a result, so that's why it's not scientific. But you do have a propensity of it, and because of that propensity, it does affect your day-to-day lives. And I think that the framework of disability best approaches how to solve this problem. Yeah, okay. Now I don't know if you want me to go more into the African
African context. Yeah, you can say a few words. You go on. I mean, I was just gonna interject and say to you, because the question that I was going to ask before talking to you about albinism, I was going to ask you, do you consider it to be a disability? But obviously, you answered that question. So, and as you were answering that question, what the thought that came into my mind was superpower. Right? I see it as you're not superpower in the sense that no, we're not going into the African context like mystical and all of that, but I'm just like, because I'm a little bit aware of that, right? But I was more thinking about it as the difference. Your difference is your superpower. Your difference is your superpower. That's the words that kind of like came into my mind. And I wanted you to like expand on how you were able to use your difference as a superpower. But please, you can kind of like do a detour and talk to us about the African context, and then talk to us about how you were able to use that difference, if it was a difference, or uniqueness, I would say, as a superpower.
So I think, in the African context regarding albinism, and of course I'm really overgeneralizing because Africa is very complex. It's complex in country, it's it's complex in tribe and ethnicity, you know. But very interestingly, something happened with regards to albinism, but I'm not sure. I don't have enough literature to know what happened, because albinism, if you read even from colonialists, there was a vast amount of realities for persons with albinism, depending where you land in Africa. So some people will say, oh, you know, these people were priests, they were generally priests or in the royal courts. Some people will say, oh, these people were demonized, and you know, they only could see at night and they lived in caves. And you know, some people kind of had sort of a neutral understanding. Some people would see them as traditional healers. That was generally their space. So you had colonialists write different expressions of what was happening regarding albinism. I don't know what happened to create a more homogeneous omen type of, you know, like good luck, bad luck. Now that's generally where it is. Like either, you know, certain communities see you as good luck or bad luck. There's something that created that consistency, and I'm not sure what it is, right? But what I do think is albinism, I hope I word this correctly, but albinism in the African context, you have to see it in the viewpoint of how Africa responds to disability. Generally, this is not all tribes, I repeat. But what is seen as disability? So, you know, in the Western world, they look at normal versus abnormal, and they have those frameworks. With the African context, they look at natural and supernatural. And supernatural, you know. So the people who are sort of the natural world, and the people who are seen as they've had some intervention, whether negative or positive, with the supernatural world. And that is probably how they will view maybe schizophrenia or other kinds of disabilities, physical disabilities, and albinism now falls within that. But the idea of disability for Africa is broader, in my opinion, because there are times, and there were tribes that used to kill twins, for instance. So something that was irregular and placed within the framework of the supernatural is how they kind of viewed disability. So you having two identical children, we may kill those children because they're somewhat disabled in our view. They are an irregular thing that is happening in our society, and we believe there's been some kind of negative divine intervention that has come. So I think albinism kind of falls within that view. It's not, the disability is not about the impairment of the eyes or that you burn. That's not the disability. The disability is that you're coming out with a color that is irregular in our society.
It's almost like it's almost like a bug in the system, right? It's like
it's almost like a
it's almost like a bug in the system, you know, like you know, when you have a bug in the, like people kind of like are completely lost. They don't know, they don't know how to explain it, so they kind of like find any kind of explanation that the first explanation that come into their mind, right? So
exactly. So I think that for me, this is at least how I understand how Africans try to make sense, or a lot of Africans try to make sense of albinism. They looked at it more from the disability framework, and you have to understand that some things that are considered disabled in the Western framework are not necessarily considered disabled in the African framework. You know, there are people, for instance, maybe who have autism, or people who have who take time to generally learn certain things. They may actually integrate in their societies just fine, and they may not be considered disabled. You know, we were speaking with a friend about this, and they would say, in other words, they are carrying their own thing. That's what you generally say. Oh, you know, if sometimes if somebody had a fit or whatever, you say, oh, this person is carrying their own things, depending on the society. So some things may be considered a disability, and some things may not be considered a disability. And in the Western framework, those things may also be considered a disability. You know, so that's what I'm saying. It's like you almost have to look at things within their own context. But for me, I think in the African framework, it is the question of natural versus supernatural. And it is the question of how how we approach what we perceive to be irregular or what we perceive to be disability in the African context. I hope I'm making sense.
No, absolutely. Total sense.
Yeah. So difference as a superpower.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think for me, as having albinism, is that, and mostly being African and a woman, is that you manage to have a very empathetic view of the world. So people can give you, and I'm talking more as a South African Black woman with albinism, people can give you different politics and you can find a way of deeply understanding them. So me listening to Native Americans talk about land, I get that. I get that deeply, you know. Me listening to trans people talk about the issue of non-binary, I get that. So it's like you fall within all of these categories where you can at least listen. It may not necessarily be that you agree with all the politics of everybody. That's not necessarily what it means, but it means that you have an ear where you can relate. Your experiences become so vast where you can pour in and relate from a sincere perspective to say, I hear you. And in a different context, I do understand you. And I think that's a superpower because as much as you're a minority, you're also highly expansive.